This is a continuation of The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim, comprising chapters 13 through 15. Chapter 13. The uneventful days, only outwardly uneventful, slipped by in floods of sunshine, and the servants, watching the four ladies, came to the conclusion there was very little life in them. To the servants, San Salvatore seemed asleep. No one came to tea, nor did the ladies go anywhere to tea. Other tenants in other springs had been far more active. There had been stir and enterprise. The boat had been used, excursions had been made, Beppo's fly was ordered, people from Mezzago came over and spent the day. The house rang with voices. Even sometimes champagne had been drunk. Life was varied. Life was interesting. But this, what was this? The servants were not even scolded. They were left completely to themselves. They yawned. Perplexing, too, was the entire absence of gentlemen. How could gentlemen keep away from so much beauty? Four added up, and even after the subtraction of the old one, the three younger ladies produced a formidable total of that which gentlemen usually sought. Also, the evident desire of each lady to spend long hours, separated from the other ladies, puzzled the servants. The result was a deathly stillness in the house, except at meal times. It might have been as empty as it had been all the winter, for any sounds of life there were. The old lady sat in her room. Alone, the dark-eyed lady wandered off alone, loitering, so Domenico told them, who sometimes came across her in the course of his duties. Incomprehensibly among the rocks, the very beautiful fair lady lay in her low chair in the top garden. Alone the less, but still beautiful fair lady went up the hills and stayed up them for hours. Alone, and every day the sun blazed slowly round the house and disappeared at evening into the sea, and nothing at all had happened. The servants yawned. Yet the four visitors, while their bodies sat, that was Mrs. Fisher's, lay, that was Lady Caroline's, or loitered, that was Mrs. Arbuthnot's, went in solitude up into the hills, that was Mrs. Wilkins's, wilking, but torpid really. Their minds were unusually busy. Even at night their minds were busy, and the dreams they had were clear, thin, quick things, entirely different from the heavy dreams of home. There was that in the atmosphere of San Salvatore which produced active-mindedness in all except the natives. They, as before, whatever the beauty around them, whatever the prodigal seasons did, remained immune from thoughts other than those they were accustomed to. All their lives they had seen, year by year, the amazing recurrent spectacle of April in the gardens, and custom had made it invisible to them. They were as blind to it, as unconscious of it, as Domenico's dog asleep in the sun. The visitors could not be blind to it. It was too arresting after London in a particularly wet and gloomy March. Suddenly to be transported to that place where the air was so still that it held its breath, where the light was so golden that the most ordinary things were transfigured, to be transported into that delicate warmth, that caressing fragrance, and to have the old grey castle as the setting, and, in the distance, the serene, clear hills of Perugini's backgrounds, was an astonishing contrast. Even Lady Caroline, used all her life to beauty, who had been everywhere and seen everything, felt the surprise of it. It was, that year, a particularly wonderful spring, and of all the months at San Salvatore, April, if the weather was fine, was best. May scorched, and withered. March was restless, and could be hard and cold in its brightness, but April came along softly like a blessing, and if it were a fine April, it was so beautiful that it was impossible not to feel different, not to feel stirred and touched. Mrs. Wilkins, we have seen, responded to it instantly. She, so to speak, at once flung off all her garments and dived straight into glory, unhesitatingly, with a cry of rapture. Mrs. Arbuthnot was stirred and touched, but differently. She had odd sensations presently to be described. Mrs. Fisher, being old, was of a closer, more impermeable texture, and offered more resistance, but she too had odd sensations, also in their place to be described. Lady Caroline, already amply acquainted with beautiful houses and climates, to whom they could not come quite with the same surprise, yet was very nearly as quick to react as Mrs. Wilkins. The place had an almost instantaneous influence on her as well, and of one part of this influence she was aware. It had made her, beginning on the very first evening, want to think, and acted on her curiously like a conscience. What this conscience seemed to press upon her notice with an insistence that startled her. Lady Caroline hesitated to accept the word, but it would keep on coming into her head, was that she was tawdry. Tawdry, fancy. She must think that out. The morning after the first dinner together, she woke up in a condition of regret that she should have been so talkative to Mrs. Wilkins the night before. What had made her be, she wondered. Now, of course, Mrs. Wilkins would want to grab. She would want to be inseparable. And the thought of a grabbing and an inseparableness that should last 4 weeks made Scrap's spirit swoon within her. No doubt the encouraged Mrs. Wilkins would be lurking in the top garden waiting to waylay her when she went out, and would hail her with morning cheerfulness. How much she hated being hailed with morning cheerfulness, or indeed, hailed at all. She oughtn't to have encouraged Mrs. Wilkins the night before. Fatal to encourage. It was bad enough not to encourage, for just sitting there and saying nothing seemed usually to involve her, but actively to encourage was suicidal. What on earth had made her, Now she would have to waste all the precious time, the precious, lovely time for thinking for getting square with herself, in shaking Mrs. Wilkins off. With great caution and on the tips of her toes, balancing herself carefully lest the pebble should scrunch, she stole out when she was dressed to her corner, but the garden was empty. No shaking off was necessary. Neither Mrs. Wilkins nor anybody else was to be seen. She had it entirely to herself, except for Domenico, who presently came and hovered, watering his plants, again especially all the plants that were nearest her. No one came out at all, and when, after a long while of following up thoughts which seemed to escape her, just as she had got them, and dropping off exhausted to sleep in the intervals of this chase, she felt hungry and looked at her watch and saw that it was past 3. She realized that nobody had even bothered to call her in to lunch, so that, Scrap could not but remark, if anyone was shaken off it was she herself. Well, but how delightful, and how very new. Now she would really be able to think, uninterruptedly. Delicious to be forgotten. Still, she was hungry, and Mrs. Wilkins, after that excessive friendliness the night before, might at least have told her lunch was ready, and she had really been excessively friendly, so nice about Mellish's sleeping arrangements, wanting him to have the spare room and all. She wasn't usually interested in arrangements. In fact, she wasn't ever interested in them, so that Scrap considered she might be said almost to have gone out of her way to be agreeable to Mrs. Wilkins, and, in return, Mrs. Wilkins didn't even bother whether or not she had any lunch. Fortunately, though she was hungry, she didn't mind missing a meal. Life was full of meals. They took up an enormous proportion of one's time, and Mrs. Fisher was, she was afraid, one of those persons who at meals linger. Twice now had she dined with Mrs. Fisher, and each time she had been difficult at the end to dislodge, lingering on, slowly cracking innumerable nuts, and slowly drinking a glass of wine that seemed as if it would never be finished. Probably it would be a good thing to make a habit of missing lunch, and as it was quite easy to have tea brought out to her, and as she breakfasted in her room, only once a day would she have to sit at the dining-room table and endure the nuts. Scrap burrowed her head comfortably in the cushions, and with her feet crossed on the low parapet gave herself up to more thought. She said to herself, as she had said at intervals throughout the morning, "Now I'm going to think." But never having thought out anything in her life, it was difficult. Extraordinary how one's attention wouldn't stay fixed, extraordinary how one's mind slipped sideways. Settling herself down to a review of her past as a preliminary to the consideration of her future, and hunting in it to begin with for any justification of that distressing word tawdry. The next thing she knew was that she wasn't thinking about this at all, but had somehow switched on to Mr. Wilkins. Well, Mr. Wilkins was quite easy to think about, though not pleasant. She viewed his approach with misgivings, for not only was it a profound and unexpected bore to have a man added to the party, and a man, too, of the kind she was sure Mr. Wilkins must be, but she was afraid, and her fear was the result of a drearily unvarying experience that he might wish to hang about her. This possibility had evidently not yet occurred to Mrs. Wilkins, and it was not one to which she could very well draw her attention, that is, without being too fatuous to live. She tried to hope that Mr. Wilkins would be a wonderful exception to the dreadful rule. If only he were, she would be so much obliged to him that she believed she might really quite like him. But she had misgivings. Suppose he hung about her so that she was driven from her lovely top garden, suppose the light in Mrs. Wilkins's funny, flickering face was blown out. Scrap felt she would particularly dislike this to happen to Mrs. Wilkins's face. Yet she had never in her life met any wives, not any at all, who had been able to understand that she didn't in the least want their husbands. Often she had met wives who didn't want their husbands either, but that made them none the less indignant if they thought somebody else did, and none the less sure, when they saw them hanging round Scrap, that she was trying to get them. The bare thought, the bare recollection of these situations, filled her with a boredom so extreme that it instantly sent her to sleep again. When she woke up, she went on with Mr. Wilkins. Now if, thought Scrap, Mr. Wilkins were not an exception and behaved in the usual way, would Mrs. Wilkins understand, or would it just simply spoil her holiday? She seemed quick, but would she be quick about just this? She seemed to understand and see inside one, but would she understand and see inside one when it came to Mr. Wilkins? The experienced Scrap was full of doubts. She shifted her feet on the parapet, she jerked a cushion straight. Perhaps she had better try and explain to Mrs. Wilkins, during the days still remaining before the arrival, explain in a general way, rather vague and talking at large, her attitude towards such things. She might also expound to her peculiar dislike of people's husbands, and her profound craving to be, at least for this 1 month, let alone. But Scrap had her doubts about this too. Such talk meant a certain familiarity, meant embarking on a friendship with Mrs. Wilkins, and if, after having embarked on it and faced the peril it contained of too much Mrs. Wilkins, Mr. Wilkins should turn out to be artful, and people did get very artful when they were set on anything and manage after all to slip through into the top garden, Mrs. Wilkins might easily believe she had been taken in, and that she, Scrap, was deceitful. And about Mr. Wilkins, wives were really pathetic. At 4:30 she heard sounds of saucers on the other side of the daphne bushes. Was tea being sent out to her? No, the sounds came no closer, They stopped near the house. Tea was to be in her garden. Scrap considered she might at least have been asked if she minded being disturbed. They all knew she sat there. Perhaps someone would bring hers to her in her corner. No, nobody brought anything. Well, she was too hungry not to go and have it with the others today, but she would give Francesca strict orders for the future. She got up and walked with that slow grace which was another of her outrageous number of attractions towards the sounds of tea. She was conscious not only of being very hungry, but of wanting to talk to Mrs. Wilkins again. Mrs. Wilkins had not grabbed, she had left her quite free all day in spite of the rapprochement the night before. Of course she was an original, and put on a silk jumper for dinner, but she hadn't grabbed. This was a great thing. Scrap went towards the tea table quite looking forward to Mrs. Wilkins, and when she came in sight of it, she saw only Mrs. Fisher and Mrs. Arbuthnot. Mrs. Fisher was pouring out the tea, and Mrs. Arbuthnot was offering Mrs. Fisher macaroons. Every time Mrs. Fisher offered Mrs. Arbuthnot anything, her cup, or milk, or sugar, Mrs. Arbuthnot offered her macaroons, pressed them on her with an odd assiduousness, almost with obstinacy. Was it a game? Scrap wondered, sitting down and seizing a macaroon. "Where is Mrs. Wilkins?" asked Scrap. They did not know. At least Mrs. Arbuthnot, on Scrap's inquiry, did not know Mrs. Fisher's face, at the name, became elaborately uninterested. It appeared that Mrs. Wilkins had not been seen since breakfast. Mrs. Arbuthnot thought she had probably gone for a picnic. Scrap missed her. She ate the enormous macaroons, the best and biggest she had ever come across, in silence. Tea without Mrs. Wilkins was dull, and Mrs. Arbuthnot had that fatal flavour of motherliness about her, of wanting to pet one, to make one very comfortable, coaxing one to eat, coaxing her, who was already so frankly, so even excessively, eating that seemed to have dogged Scrap's steps through life. Couldn't people leave one alone? She was perfectly able to eat what she wanted unincited. She tried to quench Mrs. Arbuthnot's zeal by being short with her. Useless. The shortness was not apparent. It remained, as all Scrap's evil feelings remained, covered up by the impenetrable veil of her loveliness. Mrs. Fisher sat monumentally, and took no notice of either of them. She had had a curious day, and was a little worried. She had been quite alone, for none of the three had come to lunch, and none of them had taken the trouble to let her know they were not coming, and Mrs. Arbuthnot, drifting casually into tea, had behaved oddly till Lady Caroline joined them and distracted her attention. Mrs. Fisher was prepared not to dislike Mrs. Arbuthnot, whose parted hair and mild expression seemed very decent and womanly, but she certainly had habits that were difficult to like. Her habit of instantly echoing any offer made her of food or drink, of throwing the offer back on one, as it were, was not somehow what one expected of her. "Will you have some more tea?" was surely a question to which the answer was simply yes or no, but Mrs. Arbuthnot persisted in the trick she had exhibited the day before at breakfast, of adding to her yes or no the words, "Will you?" She had done it again that morning at breakfast, and here she was doing it at tea, the two meals at which Mrs. Fisher presided and poured out. Why did she do it? Mrs. Fisher failed to understand. But this was not what was worrying her. This was merely by the way. What was worrying her was that she had been quite unable that day to settle to anything, and had done nothing but wander restlessly from her sitting room to her battlements and back again. It had been a wasted day, and how much she disliked waste. She had tried to read, and she had tried to write to Kate Lumley, but no, a few words read, a few lines written, and up she got again, and went out onto the battlements and stared at the sea. It did not matter that the letter to Kate Lumley should not be written. There was time enough for that. Let the others suppose her coming was definitely fixed. All the better. So would Mr. Wilkins be kept out of the spare room and put where he belonged. Kate would keep. She could be held in reserve. Kate in reserve was just as potent as Kate in actuality, and there were points about Kate in reserve which might be missing from Kate in actuality. For instance, if Mrs. Fisher were going to be restless, she would rather Kate were not there to see. There was a want of dignity about restlessness, about trotting backwards and forwards. But it did matter that she could not read a sentence of any of her great dead friends' writings, no, not even of Browning's, who had been so much in Italy, nor of Ruskin's, whose Stones of Venice she had brought with her to reread so nearly on the very spot, nor even a sentence of a really interesting book, like the one she had found in her sitting room about the home life of the German emperor, poor man, written in the 90s, when he had not yet begun to be more sinned against than sinning, which was, she was firmly convinced, what was the matter with him now, and full of exciting things about his birth, and his right arm and a catch hairs without having to put it down and go and stare at the sea. Reading was very important. The proper exercise and development of one's mind was a paramount duty. How could one read if one were constantly trotting in and out? Curious, this restlessness. Was she going to be ill? No, she felt well indeed, unusually well, and she went in and out quite quickly, trotted, in fact, and without her stick. Very odd that she shouldn't be able to sit still, she thought, frowning across the tops of some purple hyacinths at the Gulf of Spezia glittering beyond a headland. Very odd that she, who walked so slowly, with such dependence on her stick, should suddenly trot. It would be interesting to talk to someone about it, she felt, not to Kate, to a stranger. Kate would only look at her and suggest a cup of tea. Kate always suggested cups of tea. Besides, Kate had a flat face. That Mrs. Wilkins, now annoying as she was, loose-tongued as she was, impertinent, objectionable, would probably understand, and perhaps know what was making her be like this, but she could say nothing to Mrs. Wilkins. She was the last person to whom one would admit sensations. Dignity alone forbade it. Confide in Mrs. Wilkins? Never! And Mrs. Arbuthnot, while she wistfully mothered the obstructive scrap at tea, felt too that she had had a curious day. Like Mrs. Fisher's, it had been active, but unlike Mrs. Fisher's, only active in mind. Her body had been quite still, her mind had not been still at all. It had been excessively active. For years she had taken care to have no time to think. Her scheduled life in the parish had prevented memories and desires from intruding on her. That day they had crowded. She went back to tea feeling dejected, and that she should feel dejected in such a place with everything about her to make her rejoice only dejected her the more. But how could she rejoice alone? How could anybody rejoice and enjoy and appreciate, really appreciate, alone? Except Lottie. Lottie seemed able to. She had gone off down the hill directly after breakfast, alone yet obviously rejoicing, for she had not suggested that Rose should go too, and she was singing as she went. Rose had spent the day by herself, sitting with her hands clasping her knees, staring straight in front of her. What she was staring at were the grey swords of the agaves, and on their tall stalks the pale irises that grew in the remote place she had found, while beyond them, between the grey leaves and the blue flowers, she saw the sea. The place she had found was a hidden corner, where the sun-baked stones were padded with thyme, and nobody was likely to come. It was out of sight and sound of the house, it was off any path, it was near the end of the promontory. She sat so quiet that presently lizards darted over her feet, and some tiny birds like finches, frightened away at first, came back again and flitted among the bushes round her, just as if she hadn't been there. How beautiful it was! And what was the good of it with no one there, no one who loved being with one, who belonged to one, to whom one could say, look, and wouldn't one say, look, dearest? Yes, one would say dearest and the sweet word. Just to say it to somebody who loved one, would make one happy. She sat quite still, staring straight in front of her. Strange that in this place she did not want to pray. She who had prayed so constantly at home didn't seem able to do it here at all. The first morning she had merely thrown up a brief thank you to heaven on getting out of bed, and had gone straight to the window to see what everything looked like thrown up the thank you as carelessly as a ball, and thought no more about it. That morning, remembering this and ashamed, she had knelt down with determination, but perhaps determination was bad for prayers, for she had been unable to think of a thing to say, and as for her bedtime prayers, on neither of the nights had she said a single one. She had forgotten them. She had been so much absorbed in other thoughts that she had forgotten them, and once in bed, she was asleep and whirling along among bright, thin, swift dreams before she had so much time as to stretch herself out. What had come over her? Why had she let go the anchor of prayer? And she had difficulty, too, in remembering her poor, in remembering even that there were such things as poor. Holidays, of course, were good, and were recognized by everybody as good, but ought they so completely to blot out, to make such havoc of, the realities? Perhaps it was healthy to forget her poor with all the greater gusto would she go back to them, but it couldn't be healthy to forget her prayers, and still less could it be healthy not to mind. Rose did not mind. She knew she did not mind, and even worse, she knew she did not mind not minding. In this place she was indifferent to both the things that had filled her life, and made it seem as if it were happy for years. Well, if only she could rejoice in her wonderful new surroundings, have that much at least to set against the indifference, the letting go, but she could not. She had no work, she did not pray, she was left empty. Lottie had spoilt her day that day, as she had spoilt her day the day before. Lottie, with her invitation to her husband, with her suggestion that she too should invite hers. Having flung Frederick into her mind again the day before, Lottie had left her for the whole afternoon. She had left her alone with her thoughts. Since then they had been all of Frederick. Where at Hampstead he came to her only in her dreams, here he left her dreams free, and was with her during the day instead. And again that morning, as she was struggling not to think of him, Lottie had asked her, just before disappearing singing down the path, if she had written yet invited him, and again he was flung into her mind, and she wasn't able to get him out. How could she invite him? It had gone on so long, their estrangement, such years she would hardly know what words to use, and besides, he would not come. Why should he come? He didn't care about being with her. What could they talk about? Between them was the barrier of his work and her religion. She could not, how could she, believing as she did in purity, in responsibility for the effect of one's actions on others, bear his work, bear living by it, and he, she knew, had at first resented, and then been merely bored by her religion. He had let her slip away, he had given her up, he no longer minded, he accepted her religion indifferently, as a settled fact. Both it and she, Rose's mind, becoming more luminous in the clear light of April at San Salvatore, suddenly saw the truth bored him. Naturally, when she saw this, when that morning it flashed upon her for the first time, she did not like it. She liked it so little that for a space the whole beauty of Italy was blotted out. What was to be done about it? She could not give up believing in good and not liking evil, and it must be evil to live entirely on the proceeds of adulteries, however dead and distinguished they were. Besides, if she sacrificed her whole past, her bringing up, her work for the last 10 years, would she bore him less? Rose felt right down at her very roots that if you have once thoroughly bored somebody, it is next to impossible to unbore him. Once a bore, always a bore, certainly, she thought, to the person originally bored. Then, thought she, looking out to sea through eyes grown misty, better cling to her religion. It was better she hardly noticed the reprehensibleness of her thought than nothing. But oh, she wanted to cling to something tangible, to love something living, something that one could hold against one's heart, that one could see and touch and do things for. If her poor baby hadn't died, babies didn't get bored with one. It took them a long while to grow up and find one out, and perhaps one's baby never did find one out. Perhaps one would always be to it, however old and bearded it grew, somebody special, somebody different from everyone else, and if for no other reason, precious in that one could never be repeated. Sitting with dim eyes looking out to sea, she felt an extraordinary yearning to hold something of her very own tight to her bosom. Rose was slender, and as reserved in figure as in character, yet she felt a queer sensation of, how could she describe it? Bosom. There was something about San Salvatore that made her feel all bosom. She wanted to gather to her bosom, to comfort and protect, soothing the dear head that should lie on it with softest strokings and murmurs of love. Frederick's child come to her, pillowed on her, because they were unhappy, because they had been hurt. They would need her then. If they had been hurt, they would let themselves be loved then. If they were unhappy. Well, the child was gone, would never come now, but perhaps Frederick some day when he was old and tired. Such were Mrs. Arbuthnot's reflections and emotions that first day at San Salvatore by herself. She went back to tea dejected as she had not been for years. San Salvatore had taken her carefully built-up semblance of happiness away from her, and given her nothing in exchange. Yes, it had given her yearnings in exchange, this ache and longing, this queer feeling of bosom, but that was worse than nothing. And she who had learned balance, who never at home was irritated, but always able to be kind, could not, even in her dejection, that afternoon endure Mrs. Fisher's assumption of the position as hostess at tea. One would have supposed that such a little thing would not have touched her, but it did. Was her nature changing? Was she to be not only thrown back on long-stifled yearnings after Frederick, but also turned into somebody who wanted to fight over little things? After tea, when both Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline had disappeared again, it was quite evident that nobody wanted her. She was more dejected than ever, overwhelmed by the discrepancy between the splendour outside her, the warm, teeming beauty and self-sufficiency of nature, and the blank emptiness of her heart. Then came Lottie, back to dinner, incredibly more freckled, exuding the sunshine she had been collecting all day, talking, laughing, being tactless, being unwise, being without reticence, and Lady Caroline, so quiet at tea, woke up to animation, and Mrs. Fisher was not so noticeable, and Rose was beginning to revive a little, for Lottie's spirits were contagious, as she described the delights of her day, a day which might easily to anyone else have had nothing in it but a very long and very hot walk and sandwiches, when she suddenly said, catching Rose's eye, "Let her gone." Rose flushed. This tactlessness. What let her? Asked Scrap, interested. Both her elbows were on the table and her chin was supported in her hands, for the nut stage had been reached, and there was nothing for it but to wait in as comfortable a position as possible till Mrs. Fisher had finished cracking. Asking her husband here, said Lottie. Mrs. Fisher looked up. Another husband? Was there to be no end to them? Nor was this one, then, a widow either, but her husband was no doubt a decent, respectable man, following a decent, respectable calling. She had little hope of Mr. Wilkins, so little, that she had refrained from inquiring what he did. Has it persisted, Lottie? As Rose said nothing. No, said Rose. Oh, well, tomorrow then, said Lottie. Rose wanted to say no again to this. Lottie would have in her place, and would, besides, have expounded all her reasons, but she could not turn herself inside out like that, and invite any and everybody to come and look. How was it that Lottie, who saw so many things, didn't see stuck on her heart, and seeing keep quiet about it, the sore place that was Frederick? Who is your husband? Asked Mrs. Fisher, carefully adjusting another nut between the crackers. Who should he be? Said Rose quickly, roused at once by Mrs. Fisher to irritation, except Mr. Arbuthnot. I mean, of course, what is Mr. Arbuthnot? And Rose, gone painfully red at this, said after a tiny pause, my husband. Naturally, Mrs. Fisher was incensed. She couldn't have believed it of this one, with her decent hair and gentle voice, that she too should be impertinent. Chapter 14. That first week the wistaria began to fade, and the flowers of the Judas tree and peach trees fell off and carpeted the ground with rose colour. Then all the freesias disappeared, and the irises grew scarce, and then, While these were clearing themselves away, the double Banksia roses came out, and the big summer roses suddenly flaunted gorgeously on the walls and trellises. Fortune's yellow was one of them, a very beautiful rose. Presently the tamarisk and the daphnes were at their best, and the lilies at their tallest. By the end of the week the fig trees were giving shade, the plum blossom was out among the olives, the modest wiglias appeared in their fresh pink clothes, and on the rocks sprawled masses of thick-leaved, star-shaped flowers, some vivid purple, and some a clear, pale lemon. By the end of the week, too, Mr. Wilkins arrived, even as his wife had foreseen he would. So he did, and there were signs almost of eagerness about his acceptance of her suggestion, for he had not waited to write a letter in answer to hers, but had telegraphed. That surely was eager, it showed, Scrap thought, a definite wish for reunion, and watching his wife's happy face, and aware of her desire that Mellish should enjoy his holiday. She told herself that he would be a very unusual fool should he waste his time bothering about anybody else. If he isn't nice to her, Scrap thought, he shall be taken to the battlements and tipped over, for by the end of the week she and Mrs. Wilkins had become Caroline and Lottie to each other, and were friends. Mrs. Wilkins had always been friends, but Scrap had struggled not to be. She had tried hard to be cautious, but how difficult was caution with Mrs. Wilkins? Free herself from every vestige of it. She was so entirely unreserved, so completely expansive, that soon Scrap, almost before she knew what she was doing, was being unreserved too, and nobody could be more unreserved than Scrap once she let herself go. The only difficulty about Lottie was that she was nearly always somewhere else. You couldn't catch her, you couldn't pin her down to come and talk. Scrap's fears that she would grab seemed grotesque in retrospect. Why, there was no grab in her. At dinner and after dinner were the only times one really saw her. All day long she was invisible, and would come back in the late afternoon looking a perfect sight, her hair full of bits of moss, and her freckles worse than ever. Perhaps she was making the most of her time before Mellish arrived to do all the things she wanted to do, and meant to devote herself afterwards to going about with him, tidy and in her best clothes. Scrap watched her, interested in spite of herself, because it seemed so extraordinary to be as happy as all that on so little. San Salvatore was beautiful, and the weather was divine, but scenery and weather had never been enough for Scrap. And how could they be enough for somebody who would have to leave them quite soon and go back to life in Hampstead? Also, there was the imminence of Mellish, of that Mellish from whom Lottie had so lately run. It was all very well to feel one ought to share, and to make a beau jest and do it, but the Bugue's jesters Scrap had known hadn't made anybody happy. Nobody really liked being the object of one, and it always meant an effort on the part of the maker. Still, she had to admit there was no effort about Lottie. It was quite plain that everything she did and said was effortless, and that she was just simply, completely happy. And so Mrs. Wilkins was, for her doubts as to whether she had had time to become steady enough in serenity to go on being serene in Mellish's company, when she had it uninterruptedly right round the clock, had gone by the middle of the week, and she felt that nothing now could shake her. She was ready for anything. She was firmly grafted, rooted, built into heaven. Whatever Mellish said, or did, she would not budge an inch out of heaven, would not rouse herself a single instant to come outside it and be cross. On the contrary, she was going to pull him up into it beside her, and they would sit comfortably together, suffused in light, and laugh at how much afraid of him she used to be in Hampstead, and at how deceitful her afraidness had made her. But he wouldn't need much pulling. He would come in quite naturally after a day or two, irresistibly wafted on the scented breezes of that divine air, and there he would sit arrayed in stars, thought Mrs. Wilkins, in whose mind, among much other debris, floated occasional bright shreds of poetry. She laughed to herself a little at the picture of Mellish, that top-hatted, black-coated, respectable family solicitor, arrayed in stars, but she laughed affectionately, almost with a maternal pride in how splendid he would look in such fine clothes. Poor lamb, she murmured to herself affectionately, and added, what he wants is a thorough airing. This was during the first half of the week. By the beginning of the last half, at the end of which Mr. Wilkins arrived, she left off even assuring herself that she was unshakable, that she was permeated beyond altering by the atmosphere. She no longer thought of it, or noticed it. She took it for granted, if one may say so, and she certainly said so, not only to herself but also to Lady Caroline. She had found her celestial legs. Contrary to Mrs. Fisher's idea of the seemly, but of course contrary, what else would one expect of Mrs. Wilkins? She did not go to meet her husband at Mezzago, but merely walked down to the point where Beppo's fly would leave him and his luggage in the street of Castagneto. Mrs. Fisher disliked the arrival of Mr. Wilkins, and was sure that anybody who could have married Mrs. Wilkins must be at least of an injudicious disposition, but a husband, whatever his disposition, should be properly met. Mr. Fisher had always been properly met. Never once in his married life had he gone unmet at a station, nor had he ever not been seen off. These observances, these courtesies, strengthened the bonds of marriage, and made the husband feel he could rely on his wife's being always there. Always being there was the essential secret for a wife. What would have become of Mr. Fisher if she had neglected to act on this principle? She preferred not to think. Enough things became of him as it was for whatever one's care in stopping up. Married life yet seemed to contain chinks. But Mrs. Wilkins took no pains. She just walked down the hill singing Mrs. Fisher could hear her and picked up her husband in the street as casually as if he were a pin. The three others, still in bed, for it was not nearly time to get up, heard her as she passed beneath their windows down the zigzag path to meet Mr. Wilkins, who was coming by the morning train, and Scrap smiled, and Rose sighed, and Mrs. Fisher rang her bell and desired Francesca to bring her breakfast in her room. All three had breakfast that day in their rooms, moved by a common instinct to take cover. Scrap always breakfasted in bed, but she had the same instinct for cover, and during breakfast she made plans for spending the whole day where she was. Perhaps, though, it wouldn't be as necessary that day as the next. That day, Scrap calculated, Mellish would be provided for. He would want to have a bath, and having a bath at San Salvatore was an elaborate business, a real adventure, if one had a hot one in the bathroom, and it took a lot of time. It involved the attendance of the entire staff Domenico, and the boy Giuseppe coaxing the patent stove to burn, restraining it when it burnt too fiercely, using the bellows to it when it threatened to go out, relighting it when it did go out, Francesca anxiously hovering over the tap regulating its trickle, because if it were turned on too full the water instantly ran cold, and if not full enough the stove blew up inside and mysteriously flooded the house, and Costanza and Angela running up and down bringing pails of hot water from the kitchen to eke out what the tap did. This bath had been put in lately, and was at once the pride and the terror of the servants. It was very patent. Nobody quite understood it. There were long printed instructions as to its right treatment hanging on the wall, in which the word pericoloso recurred. When Mrs. Fisher, proceeding on her arrival to the bathroom, saw this word, she went back to her room again and ordered a sponge bath instead. And when the others found what using the bathroom meant, and how reluctant the servants were to leave them alone with the stove, and how Francesca positively refused to, and stayed with her back turned watching the tap, and how the remaining servants waited anxiously outside the door till the bather came safely out again, they too had sponge baths brought into their rooms instead. Mr. Wilkins, however, was a man, and would be sure to want a big bath. Having it, Scrap calculated, would keep him busy for a long while. Then he would unpack, and then, after his night in the train, he would probably sleep till the evening. So would he be provided for the whole of that day, and not be let loose on them till dinner. Therefore Scrap came to the conclusion she would be quite safe in the garden that day, and got up as usual after breakfast, and dawdled as usual through her dressing, listening with a slightly cocked ear to the sounds of Mr. Wilkins's arrival, of his luggage being carried into Lottie's room on the other side of the landing, of his educated voice as he inquired of Lottie, "First, do I give this fellow anything?" and immediately afterwards, "Can I have a hot bath?" Of Lottie's voice cheerfully assuring him that he needn't give the fellow anything because he was the gardener, and that yes, he could have a hot bath, and soon after this the landing was filled with the familiar noises of wood being brought, of water being brought, of feet running, of tongues vociferating, in fact, with the preparation of the bath. Scrap finished dressing, and then loitered at her window, waiting till she should hear Mr. Wilkins go into the bathroom. When he was safely there she would slip out and settle herself in her garden, and resume her inquiries into the probable meaning of her life. She was getting on with her inquiries. She dozed much less frequently, and was beginning to be inclined to agree that tawdry was the word to apply to her past. Also she was afraid that her future looked black. There she could hear Mr. Wilkins's educated voice again. Lottie's door had opened, and he was coming out of it, asking his way to the bathroom. "It's where you see the crowd," Lottie's voice answered, still a cheerful voice. Scrap was glad to notice. His steps went along the landing, and Lottie's steps seemed to go downstairs, and then there seemed to be a brief altercation at the bathroom door, hardly so much an altercation as a chorus of vociferations on one side, and a wordless determination, Scrap judged, to have a bath by oneself on the other. Mr. Wilkins knew no Italian, and the expression pericoloso left him precisely as it found him, or would have if he had seen it, but naturally he took no notice of the printed matter on the wall. He firmly closed the door on the servants, resisting Domenico, who tried to the last to press through, and locked himself in as a man should for his bath, judicially considering, as he made his simple preparations for getting in, the singular standard of behaviour of these foreigners, who, both male and female, apparently wished to stay with him while he bathed. In Finland, he had heard, the female natives not only were present on such occasions but actually washed the bath taking traveller. He had not heard, however, that this was true too of Italy, which somehow seemed much nearer civilization perhaps, because one went there and did not go to Finland. Impartially examining this reflection, and carefully balancing the claims to civilization of Italy and Finland, Mr. Wilkins got into the bath and turned off the tap. Naturally he turned off the tap. It was what one did, but on the instructions, printed in red letters, was a paragraph saying that the tap should not be turned off as long as there was still fire in the stove. It should be left on, not much on, but on until the fire was quite out, otherwise, and here again was the word pericoloso, the stove would blow up. Mr. Wilkins got into the bath, turned off the tap, and the stove blew up, exactly as the printed instructions said it would. It blew up, fortunately, only in its inside, but it blew up with a terrific noise, and Mr. Wilkins leapt out of the bath and rushed to the door, and only the instinct born of years of training made him snatch up a towel as he rushed. Scrap, halfway across the landing on her way out of doors, heard the explosion. Good heavens, she thought, remembering the instructions, there goes Mr. Wilkins. And she ran toward the head of the stairs to call the servants, and as she ran, outran Mr. Wilkins clutching his towel, and they ran into each other. That damned bath, cried Mr. Wilkins, perhaps for the only time in his life forgetting himself, but he was upset. Here was an introduction, Mr. Wilkins, imperfectly concealed in his towel, his shoulders exposed at one end and his legs at the other, and Lady Caroline Dester, to meet whom he had swallowed all his anger with his wife and come out to Italy. For Lottie in her letter had told him who was at San Salvatore besides herself and Mrs. Arbuthnot, and Mr. Wilkins at once had perceived that this was an opportunity which might never recur. Lottie had merely said, there are 2 other women here, Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline Dester, but that was enough. He knew all about the Droitwiches, their wealth, their connections, their place in history, and the power they had, should they choose to exert it, of making yet another solicitor happy by adding him to those they already employed. Some people employed one solicitor for one branch of their affairs, and another for another. The affairs of the Droitwiches must have many branches. He had also heard, for it was, he considered, part of his business to hear, and having heard to remember of the beauty of their only daughter. Even if the Droitwiches themselves did not need his services, their daughter might. Beauty led one into strange situations. Advice could never come amiss, and should none of them, neither parents nor daughter, nor any of their brilliant sons, need him in his professional capacity, it yet was obviously a most valuable acquaintance to make. It opened up vistas. It swelled with possibilities. He might go on living in Hampstead for years, and not again come across such another chance. Directly his wife's letter reached him, he telegraphed and packed. This was business. He was not a man to lose time when it came to business, nor was he a man to jeopardize a chance by neglecting to be amiable. He met his wife perfectly amiably, aware that amiability under such circumstances was wisdom. Besides, he actually felt amiable for once. Lottie was really helping him. He kissed her affectionately on getting out of Beppo's fly, and was afraid she must have got up extremely early. He made no complaints of the steepness of the walk up. He told her pleasantly of his journey, and when called upon, obediently admired the views. It was all neatly mapped out in his mind, what he was going to do that first day: have a shave, have a bath, put on clean clothes, sleep a while, and then would come lunch, and the introduction to Lady Caroline. In the train he had selected the words of his greeting, going over them with care, some slight expression of his gratification in meeting one of whom he, in common with the whole world, had heard, but of course put delicately, very delicately, some slight reference to her distinguished parents and the part her family had played in the history of England, made, of course, with proper tact, a sentence or two about her eldest brother Lord Wincombe, who had won his V.C. in the late war under circumstances which could only cause he might or might not add this every Englishman's heart to beat higher than ever with pride, and the first steps towards what might well be the turning point in his career would have been taken. And here he was. No, it was too terrible. What could be more terrible? Only a towel on water running off his legs, and that exclamation. He knew at once the lady was Lady Caroline the minute the exclamation was out. He knew it. Rarely did Mr. Wilkins use that word, and never in the presence of a lady or a client. While as for the towel, why had he come? Why had he not stayed in Hampstead? It would be impossible to live this down. But Mr. Wilkins was reckoning without Scrap. She, indeed, screwed up her face at the first flash of him on her astonished sight in an enormous effort not to laugh, and having choked the laughter down and got her face serious again, she said, as composedly as if he had had all his clothes on, "How do you do?" What perfect tact! Mr. Wilkins could have worshipped her, this exquisite ignoring. Blue blood, of course, coming out. Overwhelmed with gratitude, he took her offered hand, and said how do you do in his turn, and merely to repeat the ordinary words seemed magically to restore the situation to the normal. Indeed, he was so much relieved, and it was so natural to be shaking hands, to be conventionally greeting, that he forgot he had only towel on, and his professional manner came back to him. He forgot what he was looking like, but he did not forget that this was Lady Caroline Dester, the lady he had come all the way to Italy to see, and he did not forget that it was in her face, her lovely and important face, that he had flung his terrible exclamation. He must at once entreat her forgiveness. To say such a word to a lady, to any lady, but of all ladies to just this one. "I'm afraid I used unpardonable language," began Mr. Wilkins very earnestly, as earnestly and ceremoniously as if he had had his clothes on. "I thought it most appropriate," said Scrap, who was used to dams. Mr. Wilkins was incredibly relieved and soothed by this answer. No offence, then, taken. Blue blood again. Only blue blood could afford such a liberal, such an understanding attitude. "It is Lady Caroline Dester, is it not, to whom I am speaking?" he asked, his voice sounding even more carefully cultivated than usual, for he had to restrain too much pleasure, too much relief, too much of the joy of the pardoned and the shriven from getting into it. "Yes," said Scrap, and for the life of her she couldn't help smiling. She couldn't help it. She hadn't meant to smile at Mr. Wilkins, not ever, but really he looked, and then his voice on the top of the rest of him, oblivious of the towel and his legs, and talking just like a church. "Allow me to introduce myself," said Mr. Wilkins, with the ceremony of the drawing-room. "My name is Mellish Wilkins." And he instinctively held out his hand a second time at the words. "I thought perhaps it was," said Scrap, a second time having hers shaken and a second time unable not to smile. He was about to proceed to the first of the graceful tributes he had prepared in the train, oblivious, as he could not see himself, that he was without his clothes, when the servants came running up the stairs and, simultaneously, Mrs. Fisher appeared in the doorway of her sitting room. For all this had happened very quickly, and the servants away in the kitchen, and Mrs. Fisher pacing her battlements, had not had time on hearing the noise to appear before the second handshake. The servants, when they heard the dreaded noise, knew at once what had happened, and rushed straight into the bathroom to try and staunch the flood, taking no notice of the figure on the landing in the towel. But Mrs. Fisher did not know what the noise could be, and coming out of her room to inquire stood rooted on the door sill. It was enough to root anybody. Lady Caroline shaking hands with what evidently, if he had had clothes on, would have been Mrs. Wilkins's husband, and both of them conversing just as if. Then Scrap became aware of Mrs. Fisher. She turned to her at once. "Do let me," she said gracefully, "introduce Mr. Mellish Wilkins. He has just come. This," she added, turning to Mr. Wilkins, "is Mrs. Fisher." And Mr. Wilkins, nothing if not courteous, reacted at once to the conventional formula. First he bowed to the elderly lady in the doorway, then he crossed over to her, his wet feet leaving footprints as he went, and having got to her he politely held out his hand. "It is a pleasure," said Mr. Wilkins in his carefully modulated voice, "to meet a friend of my wife's." Scrap melted away down into the garden. Chapter 15. The strange effect of this incident was that when they met that evening at dinner, both Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline had a singular feeling of secret understanding with Mr. Wilkins. He could not be to them as other men, he could not be to them as he would have been if they had met him in his clothes. There was a sense of broken ice they felt at once, intimate and indulgent almost they felt to him as nurses do, as those feel who have assisted either patients or young children at their baths. They were acquainted with Mr. Wilkins's legs. What Mrs. Fisher said to him that morning in her first shock will never be known, but what Mr. Wilkins said to her in reply, when reminded by what she was saying of his condition, was so handsome in its apology, so proper in its confusion, that she had ended by being quite sorry for him and completely placated. After all, it was an accident, and nobody could help accidents. And when she saw him next at dinner, dressed, polished, spotless as to linen and sleek as to hair, she felt this singular sensation of a secret understanding with him, and added to it, of a kind of almost personal pride in his appearance, now that he was dressed, which presently extended in some subtle way to an almost personal pride in everything he said. There was no doubt whatever in Mrs. Fisher's mind that a man was infinitely preferable as a companion to a woman. Mr. Wilkins's presence and conversation at once raised the standard of the dinner table from that of a bear garden, yes, a bear garden, to that of a civilized social gathering. He talked as men talk, about interesting subjects, and, though most courty-courty to Lady Caroline, showed no traces of dissolving into simpers and idiocy whenever he addressed her. He was, indeed, precisely as courteous to Mrs. Fisher herself, and when for the first time at that table politics were introduced, he listened to her with the proper seriousness on her exhibiting a desire to speak, and treated her opinions with the attention they deserved. He appeared to think much as she did about Lloyd George, and in regard to literature he was equally sound. In fact, there was real conversation, and he liked nuts. How he could have married Mrs. Wilkins was a mystery. Lottie, for her part, looked on with round eyes. She had expected Mellish to take at least 2 days before he got to this stage, but the San Salvatore spell had worked instantly. It was not only that he was pleasant at dinner, for she had always seen him pleasant at dinners with other tin, but he had been pleasant all day privately, so pleasant that he had complimented her on her looks, while she was brushing out her hair, and kissed her. And it was neither good morning nor good night. Well, this being so, she would put off telling him the truth about her nest egg, and about Rose not being his hostess after all, till next day. Pity to spoil things. She had been going to blurt it out as soon as he had had a rest, but it did seem a pity to disturb such a very beautiful frame of mind as that of Mellish this first day. Let him too get more firmly fixed in heaven. Once fixed he wouldn't mind anything. Her face sparkled with delight at the instantaneous effect of San Salvatore. Even the catastrophe of the bath, of which she had been told when she came in from the garden, had not shaken him. Of course, all that he had needed was a holiday. What a brute she had been to him when he wanted to take her himself to Italy. But this arrangement, as it happened, was ever so much better, though not through any merit of hers. She talked and laughed gaily, not a shred of fear of him left in her, and even when she said, struck by his spotlessness, that he looked so clean that one could eat one's dinner off him, and Scrap laughed. Mellish laughed too. He would have minded that at home, supposing that at home she had had the spirit to say it. It was a successful evening. Scrap, whenever she looked at Mr. Wilkins, saw him in his towel, dripping water, and felt indulgent. Mrs. Fisher was delighted with him. Rose was a dignified hostess in Mr. Wilkins's eyes, quiet and dignified, and he admired the way she waved her right to preside at the head of the table, as a graceful compliment, of course, to Mrs. Fisher's age. Mrs. Arbuthnot was, opined Mr. Wilkins, naturally retiring. She was the most retiring of the three ladies. He had met her before dinner alone for a moment in the drawing-room, and had expressed in appropriate language his sense of her kindness in wishing him to join her party, and she had been retiring. Was she shy? Probably. She had blushed, and murmured as if in deprecation, and then the others had come in. At dinner she talked least. He would, of course, become better acquainted with her during the next few days, and it would be a pleasure, he was sure. Meanwhile Lady Caroline was all and more than all Mr. Wilkins had imagined, and had received his speeches, worked in skillfully between the courses, graciously. Mrs. Fisher was the exact old lady he had been hoping to come across all his professional life, and Lottie had not only immensely improved, but was obviously au mieux. Mr. Wilkins knew what was necessary in French with Lady Caroline. He had been much tormented during the day by the thought of how he had stood conversing with Lady Caroline, forgetful of his not being dressed, and had at last written her a note most deeply apologizing, and beseeching her to overlook his incomprehensible obliviousness, to which she had replied in pencil on the back of the envelope, "Don't worry," and he had obeyed her commands, and had put it from him. The result was he was now in great contentment. Before going to sleep that night he pinched his wife's ear. She was amazed. These endearments. What is more, the morning brought no relapse in Mr. Wilkins, and he kept up to this high level throughout the day, in spite of its being the first day of the second week, and therefore pay-day. Its being pay-day precipitated Lottie's confession, which she had, when it came to the point, been inclined to put off a little longer. She was not afraid, she dared anything, but Mellish was in such an admirable humour, why risk clouding it just yet? When, however, soon after breakfast, Costanza appeared with a pile of very dirty little bits of paper covered with sums in pencil, and having knocked at Mrs. Fisher's door, and been sent away, and at Lady Caroline's door, and been sent away, and at Rose's door, and had no answer, because Rose had gone out, she waylaid Lottie, who was showing Mellish over the house, and pointed to the bits of paper, and talked very rapidly and loud, and shrugged her shoulders a great deal, and kept on pointing at the bits of paper. Lottie remembered that a week had passed without anybody paying anything to anyone, and that the moment had come to settle up. "Does this good lady want something?" inquired Mr. Wilkins mellifluously. "Money," said Lottie. "Money. It's the housekeeping bills." "Well, you have nothing to do with those," said Mr. Wilkins serenely. "Oh yes, I have." And the confession was precipitated. It was wonderful how Mellish took it. One would have imagined that his sole idea about the nest egg had always been that it should be lavished on just this. He did not, as he would have done at home, cross-examine her. He accepted everything as it came pouring out, about her fibs and all, and when she had finished and said, "You have every right to be angry, I think, but I hope you won't be and will forgive me," instead he merely asked, "What can be more beneficial than such a holiday?" Whereupon she put her arm through his, and held it tight, and said, "Oh, Mellish, you really are too sweet," her face red with pride in him. That he should so quickly assimilate the atmosphere, that he should at once become nothing but kindness, showed surely what a real affinity he had with good and beautiful things. He belonged quite naturally in this place of heavenly calm. He was extraordinary how she had misjudged him, by nature a child of light, fancy not minding the dreadful fibs she had gone in for before leaving home, fancy passing even those over without comment. Wonderful, yet not wonderful, for wasn't he in heaven? In heaven nobody minded any of those done with things, one didn't even trouble to forgive and forget. One was much too happy. She pressed his arm tight in her gratitude and appreciation, and though he did not withdraw his, neither did he respond to her pressure. Mr. Wilkins was of a cool habit, and rarely had any real wish to press. Meanwhile Costanza, perceiving that she had lost the Wilkinses' ear, had gone back to Mrs. Fisher, who at least understood Italian, besides being clearly in the servants' eyes the one of the party marked down by age and appearance to pay the bills, and to her, while Mrs. Fisher put the final touches to her toilette, for she was preparing, by means of putting on a hat and veil and feather boa and gloves, to go for her first stroll in the lower garden, positively her first. Since her arrival she explained that, unless she was given money to pay the last week's bills, the shops of Castagneto would refuse credit for the current week's food. Not even credit would they give, affirmed Costanza, who had been spending a great deal, and was anxious to pay all her relations what was owed them, and also to find out how her mistresses took it, for that day's meals. Soon it would be the hour of collation, and how could there be collation without meat, without fish, without eggs, without... Mrs. Fisher took the bills out of her hand and looked at the total, and she was so much astonished by its size, so much horrified by the extravagance to which it testified, that she sat down at her writing table to go into the thing thoroughly. Costanza had a very bad half-hour. She had not supposed it was in the English to be so mercenary, and then La Vecchia, as she was called in the kitchen, knew so much Italian, and with a doggedness that filled Costanza with shame on her behalf. For such conduct was the last one expected from the noble English. She went through item after item, requiring and persisting till she got them, explanations. There were no explanations, except that Costanza had had one glorious week of doing exactly as she chose, of splendid unbridled license, and that this was the result. Costanza, having no explanations, wept. It was miserable to think she would have to cook from now on under watchfulness, under suspicion, and what would her relations say when they found the orders they received were whittled down? They would say she had no influence, they would despise her. Costanza wept, but Mrs. Fisher was unmoved. In slow and splendid Italian, with the roll of the cantos of the Inferno, she informed her that she would pay no bills till the following week, and that meanwhile the food was to be precisely as good as ever, and at a quarter the cost. Costanza threw up her hands. Next week, proceeded Mrs. Fisher unmoved. If she found this had been so, she would pay the whole. Otherwise she paused for what she would do, otherwise she did not know herself, but she paused and looked impenetrable, majestic and menacing, and Costanza was cowed. Then Mrs. Fisher, having dismissed her with a gesture, went in search of Lady Caroline to complain. She had been under the impression that Lady Caroline ordered the meals and therefore was responsible for the prices, but now it appeared that the cook had been left to do exactly as she pleased ever since they got there, which of course was simply disgraceful. Scrap was not in her bedroom, but the room on Mrs. Fisher's opening the door, for she suspected her of being in it, and only pretending not to hear the knock, was still flower-like from her presence. Scent, sniffed Mrs. Fisher, shutting it again, and she wished Carlyle could have had 5 minutes straight talk with this young woman, and yet perhaps even he. She went downstairs to go into the garden in search of her, and in the hall encountered Mr. Wilkins. He had his hat on, and was lighting a cigar. Indulgent as Mrs. Fisher felt towards Mr. Wilkins, and peculiarly and even mystically related after the previous morning's encounter, she yet could not like a cigar in the house. Out of doors she endured it, but it was not necessary, when out of doors was such a big place, to indulge the habit indoors. Even Mr. Fisher, who had been, she should say, a man originally tenacious of habits, had quite soon after marriage got out of this one. However, Mr. Wilkins, snatching off his hat on seeing her, instantly threw the cigar away. He threw it into the water a great jar of arum lilies presumably contained, and Mrs. Fisher, aware of the value men attached to their newly lit cigars, could not but be impressed by this immediate and magnificent amende honourable. But the cigar did not reach the water. It got caught in the lilies, and smoked on by itself among them, a strange and depraved-looking object. "Where are you going to, my began Mr. Wilkins, advancing towards Mrs. Fisher, but he broke off just in time. Was it morning spirits impelling him to address Mrs. Fisher in the terms of a nursery rhyme? He wasn't even aware that he knew the thing. Most strange. What could have put it, at such a moment, into his self-possessed head? He felt great respect for Mrs. Fisher, and would not for the world have insulted her by addressing her as a maid, pretty or otherwise. He wished to stand well with her. She was a woman of parts, and also he suspected of property. At breakfast they had been most pleasant together, and he had been struck by her apparent intimacy with well-known persons, Victorians of course, but it was restful to talk about them after the strain of his brother-in-law's Georgian parties on Hampstead Heath. He and she were getting on famously, he felt. She already showed all the symptoms of presently wishing to become a client. Not for the world would he offend her. He turned a little cold at the narrowness of his escape. She had not, however, noticed. "You are going out," he said very politely, all readiness should she confirm his assumption to accompany her. "I want to find Lady Caroline," said Mrs. Fisher, going towards the glass door leading into the top garden. "An agreeable quest," remarked Mr. Wilkins. "May I assist in the search?" "Allow me," he added, opening the door for her. "She usually sits over in that corner behind the bushes," said Mrs. Fisher, "and I don't know about it being an agreeable quest. She has been letting the bills run up in the most terrible fashion, and needs a good scolding." "Lady Caroline," said Mr. Wilkins, unable to follow such an attitude. "What has Lady Caroline, if I may inquire, to do with the bills here?" The housekeeping was left to her, and as we all share alike it ought to have been a matter of honour with her. "But Lady Caroline housekeeping for the party here?" "A party which includes my wife." "My dear lady, you render me speechless. Do you not know she is the daughter of the Droitwich?" "Oh, is that who she is?" said Mrs. Fisher, scrunching heavily over the pebbles towards the hidden corner. "Well, that accounts for it. The muddle that man Droitwich made in his department in the war was a national scandal. It amounted to misappropriation of the public funds. But it is impossible, I assure you, to expect the daughter of the Droitwiches," began Mr. Wilkins earnestly. "The Droitwiches," interrupted Mrs. Fisher, are neither here nor there. Duties undertaken should be performed. I don't intend my money to be squandered for the sake of any Droitwiches. A headstrong old lady. Perhaps not so easy to deal with as he had hoped, but how wealthy. Only the consciousness of great wealth would make her snap her fingers in this manner at the Droitwiches. Lottie, on being questioned, had been vague about her circumstances, and had described her house as a mausoleum with gold fish swimming about in it, but now he was sure she was more than very well off. Still, he wished he had not joined her at this moment, for he had no sort of desire to be present at such a spectacle as the scolding of Lady Caroline Dester. Again, however, he was reckoning without Scrap. Whatever she felt when she looked up and beheld Mr. Wilkins discovering her corner on the very first morning, nothing but angelicness appeared on her face. She took her feet off the parapet on Mrs. Fisher's sitting down on it, and listening gravely to her opening remarks, as to her not having any money to fling about in reckless and uncontrolled household expenditure, interrupted her flow by pulling one of the cushions from behind her head and offering it to her. "Sit on this," said Scrap, holding it out. "You'll be more comfortable." Mr. Wilkins leapt to relieve her of it. "Oh, thanks," said Mrs. Fisher, interrupted. It was difficult to get into the swing again. Mr. Wilkins inserted the cushion solicitously between the slightly raised Mrs. Fisher and the stone of the parapet, and again she had to say thanks. It was interrupted. Besides, Lady Caroline said nothing in her defence. She only looked at her, and listened with the face of an attentive angel. It seemed to Mr. Wilkins that it must be difficult to scold a Dester who looked like that, and so exquisitely said nothing. Mrs. Fisher, he was glad to see, gradually found it difficult herself, for her severity slackened, and she ended by saying lamely, "You ought to have told me you were not doing it." "I didn't know you thought I was," said the lovely voice. "I would now like to know," said Mrs. Fisher, "what you propose to do for the rest of the time here." "Nothing," said Scrap, smiling. "Nothing, do you mean to say?" "If I may be allowed, ladies," interposed Mr. Wilkins in his suavest professional manner, to make a suggestion. They both looked at him, and remembering him as they first saw him felt indulgent. "I would advise you not to spoil a delightful holiday with worries over housekeeping." "Exactly," said Mrs. Fisher. "It is what I intend to avoid." "Most sensible," said Mr. Wilkins. "Why not, then," he continued, "allow the cook, an excellent cook, by the way, so much a head per diem." Mr. Wilkins knew what was necessary in Latin, and tell her that for this sum she must cater for you, and not only cater but cater as well as ever. One could easily reckon it out. The charges of a moderate hotel, for instance, would do as a basis, halved, or perhaps even quartered. "And this week that has just passed?" asked Mrs. Fisher. "The terrible bills of this first week? What about them?" "They shall be my present to San Salvatore," said Scrap, who didn't like the idea of Lottie's nest egg being reduced so much beyond what she was prepared for. There was a silence. The ground was cut from under Mrs. Fisher's feet. "Of course, if you choose to throw your money about," she said at last, disapproving but immensely relieved, while Mr. Wilkins was wrapped in the contemplation of the precious qualities of blue blood. This readiness, for instance, not to trouble about money, this free-handedness, it was not only what one admired in others perhaps more than anything else, but it was extraordinarily useful to the professional classes. When met with it should be encouraged by warmth of reception. Mrs. Fisher was not warm. She accepted, from which he deduced that with her wealth went closeness, but she accepted grudgingly. Presents were presents, and one did not look them in this manner in the mouth, he felt. And if Lady Caroline found her pleasure in presenting his wife and Mrs. Fisher with their entire food for a week, it was their part to accept gracefully. One should not discourage gifts. On behalf of his wife, then, Mr. Wilkins expressed what she would wish to express, and remarking to Lady Caroline with a touch of lightness, for so should gifts be accepted in order to avoid embarrassing the donor, that she had in that case been his wife's hostess since her arrival. He turned almost gaily to Mrs. Fisher, and pointed out that she and his wife must now jointly write Lady Caroline the customary letter of thanks for hospitality. "A Collins," said Mr. Wilkins, who knew what was necessary in literature. "I prefer the name Collins for such a letter to either that of board and lodging or bread and butter. Let us call it a Collins." Scrap smiled, and held out her cigarette case. Mrs. Fisher could not help being mollified. A way out of waste was going to be found, thanks to Mr. Wilkins, and she hated waste quite as much as having to pay for it. Also, a way was found out of housekeeping. For a moment she had thought that if everybody tried to force her into housekeeping on her brief holiday by their own indifference, Lady Caroline, or inability to speak Italian, the other two, she would have to send for Kate Lumley after all. Kate could do it. Kate and she had learnt Italian together. Kate would only be allowed to come on condition that she did do it. But this was much better, this way of Mr. Wilkins's. Really a most superior man. There was nothing like an intelligent, not too young man for profitable and pleasurable companionship. And when she got up, the business for which she had come being settled, and said she now intended to take a little stroll before lunch, Mr. Wilkins did not stay with Lady Caroline, as most of the men she had known would, she was afraid, have wanted to. He asked to be permitted to go and stroll with her, so that he evidently definitely preferred conversation to faces. A sensible, companionable man. A clever, well-read man. A man of the world. A man. She was very glad indeed she had not written to Kate the other day. What did she want with Kate? She had found a better companion. But Mr. Wilkins did not go with Mrs. Fisher because of her conversation, but because, when she got up and he got up, because she got up, intending merely to bow her out of the recess. Lady Caroline had put her feet up on the parapet again, and arranging her head sideways in the cushions had shut her eyes. The daughter of the Droitwiches desired to go to sleep. It was not for him, by remaining, to prevent her. This concludes the 5th part, of 7 total, of The Enchanted April, by Elizabeth von Arnim, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.